All right, so when we left off, we were talking about the development of a national identity. And we talked about all the things that were going on that made Americans something different from, from the rest of the world. And we left off with the Articles Confederation, our first constitution. And I gave you a whole list of weaknesses of it. No chief executive, no standing army, no power to tax, no separation of power. We went through this whole list of weaknesses that it had. It was so weak that almost immediately there began a movement calling to revise the Articles of Confederation. As early as 1783, Alexander Hamilton is already saying, this document's not going to work. It's flawed. We need a stronger national government. So in 1786, the first big convention to redraft our Constitution is called. It's the Annapolis Convention. It's called by Virginia and Maryland with the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. AOC is Articles of Confederation. They invite all 13 states. 5 showed up for it.
Thank you.
Okay? That's kind of how our nation works at this time period. Remember, the Articles of Confederation was a union of states more than it was a nation. People weren't thinking of themselves as Americans. You were a Virginian or a Marylander or a Delawarean. You were not an American. There was something else there. Your state loyalty was what was important to you. All right, so what is this new plan of union going to be? There's going to be 2 plans that are put out. The Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. Now, when we were in 8th grade and we studied this, we called it the big state plan and the little state plan. That's still okay, but we're a little older now, and we're going to give it its real names. We're going to name it after the states that proposed it. The Virginia plan was proposed by James Madison, and it was called the big state plan by some people because it favored states with a larger population. It called for a bicameral Congress. Bicameral means 2 houses. Okay? So we have today a House of Representatives and a Senate. It called for a bicameral Congress with representation being determined by population. So the more people you had that lived in your state, the more votes you would have in Congress. Big states like this because it gives the big states more votes than the little states, which is reasonable if you think about it. This sounds fair to me. If more people live in your state should have more votes. I mean, I would be pretty upset if Rhode Island had the same number of votes as Texas today. Because, 4 people live in Rhode Island. That's not true. Rhode Island actually has a pretty big population. Let's say Montana. 4 people live in Montana. More people live in Cherokee County than live in Montana. It's probably pretty close. And it called for a president, but the president would be elected by Congress. So we would elect our congressman and then they would pick a president. The New Jersey plan, also called the Little State Plan, it favored your smaller population states. It called for a unicameral Congress. But its idea was it's not fair for some states to have more votes than others. So they called for every state to have the same number of votes. I see why they would call that fair too. We're a state too, we should have the same number of votes as the other state does. I get that. But if you're in a state with a big population, you're not going to like it. And again, unicameral, one house. It also called to give the government a national tax power. Remember, that was one of the weaknesses. And to allow the federal government to regulate interstate trade. That was a weakness of the Articles. So you have two different plans going out there. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to do what Congress always does. We're going to argue, we're going to bicker, and eventually we're going to reach a compromise. This compromise is alternatively called the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. The reason I like Connecticut Compromises better is because there's something else that we call the Great Compromise later on, and it can confuse you. So it's put out by Connecticut. We go with that name most of the time. So what's the compromise going to be? Well, they're going to take a little bit from both. They're going to take the Bicameral Legislature from the Virginia plan, a two-house legislature. But to keep the small states happy, they're going to take something from them as well. Because in this two-house, only the lower house is determined by population. The upper house, the Senate, would have equality of representation. Every state would have 2 senators. And any law that was passed had to go through both houses to do it. So your big states could push through legislation in the House. But then it could stall out in the Senate if the small states didn't want it. And the small states could push through legislation in the Senate, but they couldn't get it past the House if the big states didn't want it. It forced compromise. To me, this is one of the best things we ever did. This is why we have a House of Representatives and a Senate. So, what are we going to do? Let's talk about this Constitutional Convention. Remember why it was called? It was called to amend the Articles of Confederation. What does it mean to amend something?
Put it in effect.
Can means to change it, okay? When you amend something, you're fixing it, you're repairing it. So what they did is they met for this convention. And the very first thing they did was they swore everybody an oath of secrecy, that nothing leaves this room. I'm always worried when you go to a meeting and your buddies say, all right, we're about to talk about something, but before we do, you got to promise you're not going to tell anybody what happens in this room. That's usually what my friends say right before we go to Vegas or New Orleans. Okay? And not good. They're planning on doing something, right? And they go inside, and their very first action is illegal. They decide that the articles are so broken that they can't be amended. Instead, they throw the articles away and they write a new law. And they say the new Constitution will go into place when 9 of the 13 states agree to it. There's a problem with this. Under the law, the Articles of Confederation said that it had to be a unanimous decision to change it. It required all 13 states. So they've already changed the rules. Why do you think they changed that rule?
It's not everyone's going to agree. Everybody's going to agree.
Because Rhode Island exists, yes. And as long as Rhode Island exists, there's never going to be unanimity about anything. If you stepped outside and said the sky was blue, Rhode Island would argue with you. So they needed to lower that standard a little bit.
Are they still like that?
Rhode Island is the only state that has voted against every war we have ever engaged in.
kinda wanna live there.
We should go to war.
They,
You blow them off the map.
they just vote no to everything. I kind of love it. It is finally ratified. The new Constitution goes into effect. Delaware was the first state to ratify it. New Hampshire was the 9th, so New Hampshire is the state that puts it into effect. That's why New Hampshire is called the Constitution State. The people that favored the Constitution were called Federalists. The people who opposed it were called Anti-Federalists. So how do you go about getting it through? Well, a deal had to be made between those two. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail later. We're going to get a Bill of Rights. We're going to buy off the Anti-Federalists. In 1789, the new government went into place. And our U.S. Constitution has been running this country since 1789. One of the things they included in it was the separation of power. You need to write this down too. The guy that came up with this was Charles de Montesquieu, the Baron of Montesquieu. The Baron de Montesquieu said that all powers should be divided. We've talked about this before, but this is a good place to put it again. A reminder, because this shows up a lot on your tests. An executive, a legislative, and a judicial. By now, you should be sick of hearing that. You've been hearing it since 4th grade. There are 3 branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. Which one is the president?
Executive.
Executive. His job is to carry out or execute the laws. Okay? The legislative branch writes the laws. How do you remember that? Legislative law. Legislative law. Okay? And the judicial branch is the court system. I remember that by going judicial judge. Judicial judge. Okay? So their job is to interpret the law. So one writes it, one executes it, and one interprets it. And they all limit each other's power. Why is it important to have separation of power?
So we don't
No,
turn
we-
into a dictatorship.
There you go. So no one group can dominate it, right? You don't end up with a dictator. Whether that dictator be a king or
You.
a legislator. If it was me, it'd be good.